For more on the race to Mars and global space programs, this is John Venable, an Air Force and Space Force analyst at the Heritage Foundation. So I want to start off by talking about this new space race that we're seeing and efforts by the Russians, the Chinese, the Emiratis, the Americans to head to Mars. What does this look like right now for people who haven't been following it too closely?
Trey, it's a great question. The United States has been sending satellites, observation platforms, and rovers of one ilk or another to Mars for many years, and we've been doing it for exploration purposes, and it's all basically NASA driven. And you've watched over the last several years that list of nations and organizations that have sent vehicles to Mars grow significantly. Russia, China, India, the European Union, and very recently the UAE joined that parade of nations that have been there. Perhaps the biggest driver for most of those is actually exploration. You can look at individual countries and see that, like the UAE, they're really trying to blossom their technical prowess, and literally the number of people within the United Arab Emirates who are driving for technical degrees and bringing them up to a level where they can compete with other nations technically in the space race. They've got a couple of certainly challenges with that, but that's their primary drive. China, Russia, the United States, India, it's all more or less along the same lines, with a couple of caveats. When you create a wake behind you as you drive towards exploration and ventures into space, people want to join that entourage, if you will. So with the International Space Station, you got to see many nations, Israel and the likes, send astronauts up to that orbiting platform and become part of this space nation club, if you will. And that's important. And when you look at the United States and how it's tried to bring about a body of nations behind it, you can look at the Artemis program and see what they're trying to do in establishing space norms. China is trying to do the same thing, and they're actually driving their own wake, and people are falling in behind it. And what the United States is trying to do, specifically with Artemis, is get space norms to where we know how to drive behavior of other nations, and that's one of the major reasons behind the United States and China's drive towards this exploration of Mars. The other nations have similar.
I was going to ask you about the Chinese and U.S. sort of space race as it relates specifically to Mars. I mean, we've seen this week some major developments in terms of that exploration. Tomorrow, NASA's Perseverance rover is set to land on Mars. We do know the Chinese have been beaming back some new images of Mars from their own program. Do you see this as sort of the first step to an area and an arena that could ultimately be military related? And is that sort of why these developments aren't necessarily concerning but are important to watch?
It's really hard to separate the programs from China and the United States, from military, civilian, and commercial. They're all intertwined very deeply. The United States particularly so now with its reliance on SpaceX and the other commercial launch organizations that are out there. Certainly, as you go forward into exploration, there are boundaries that are going to be crossed. The technology is 95%. It crosses all three spectrums: commercial, civil, and military. But as you start doing this exploration, it's kind of like shipping back in the 17 and 1800s. You have commerce that's going back and forth, and over time you can have entities come in and start pilfering some of that, or shaping the ability of other people to go in and gain from their efforts with commerce. And while you can't say specifically right now that China or the United States is going to have parallel efforts where you have a protective body alongside a commercial venture. You can't say that, but you can kind of see the need, certainly as the number of nations that are going in that direction expands. That competition is natural, and the want to protect that your own efforts, particularly with commercial entities, is going to be there, Trey.
You've been listening to John Venable, an Air Force and Space Force analyst at the Heritage Foundation. We saw under the Trump administration the start of Space Force, and it's something that the Biden administration has pledged to continue and support from the Department of Defense. Talk to me about the role the Space Force is ultimately going to play in these governing laws that you talk about that will, as space exploration expands, be more and more necessary.
Yeah. So if you just go back in history, the origins of U.S. space program goes back to a program called the International Geospatial Year, IGY, and trying to launch the first satellite into space. That effort from the United States had two different arms to it. One is we wanted to certainly explore the boundaries of space, and get the data back from that. But the other one was to establish space norms to where we could send spy satellites and surveillance satellites over other territories without restriction. And that line of thinking is always going to be there. So the Artemis program, if you look at it right now, is not just a commercial line. It's trying to get the conduct of all aspects of space into space norms of what is normal conduct, what is acceptable conduct, and then when you start tripping over wires that we as a nation and other nation states would say that is abnormal or unacceptable conduct. And so those two things are going to be intertwined throughout this. The Trump administration did a great work in getting us back up to speed with other nations with regard to the military side of life. China and Russia militarized space many years ago, and we more or less ignored that. And so the Space Force and its implementation and bringing back Space Command, that combatant command that deals with this domain of space, those were huge steps in bringing us up to military parity in some sense of at least recognizing space as a warfighting domain and then starting to compete again in that arena. And so a little bit separated in that sense, Trey. The Space Force was really big in bringing us up to speed and in that domain of being able to compete in a warfighting, protect your own assets, and be able to put others at risk. So that was huge.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense.